Puerto Rico, a stunning tropical island, has been tied to the wealthiest nation on Earth for over a century. So why is it still struggling with poverty? Just 1,000 miles off the coast of Florida, Puerto Rico is a unique case in the Caribbean. Unlike its neighbors, Puerto Rico has been an unincorporated territory of the United States since the 1800s. But the question is, why this relationship hasn't brought the prosperity you'd expect, and instead has kept Puerto Rico in a cycle of poverty for generations? What hidden forces are keeping Puerto Rico from thriving despite its US ties? And how has America's influence shaped, or even stalled, the island's future in ways few realize? If Puerto Rico were considered its own economy, it would rank as the Caribbean's second largest, just behind the Dominican Republic. With an average income per person around $41,000, it's even higher than several European countries. Yet, life for many Puerto Ricans tells a different story, with issues like economic stagnation, a declining population, high debt, natural disasters, and poor governance topping the list. Despite being US citizens, Puerto Ricans lack the same political rights as people on the mainland. They follow federal laws, can be drafted into the military, yet have no voting power over the policies that impact them. This lack of influence has led to decades of neglect from Washington. Even America's poorest state, Mississippi, is still economically better off than Puerto Rico. The income gap is stark, with Puerto Ricans making less than half of what people typically earn on the mainland. And despite its greater need, Puerto Rico receives far less federal support than US states of similar size. For example, Mississippi and Puerto Rico both have about 3 million residents, yet Puerto Rico only gets a fraction of Medicaid funds, though nearly half of its people live in poverty, a rate that's almost 5 times higher than the US mainland. This disparity is just one way the US keeps a firm grip on Puerto Rico, making it tough for the island to prosper. The economic toll is evident. Between 2004 and 2017, Puerto Rico's economy shrank by 14%, a drop so severe it would be one of the worst ever seen by a non-wartime nation if Puerto Rico were independent. Things have become so bleak that in just the past 5 years, more people have left the island than during the major migration post-World War II. Sadly, this pattern of poverty extends across all US territories, which generally lag far behind the mainland in wealth. But Puerto Rico bears the brunt of this, with decades of neglect and poor leadership pushing it to the edge. So how did an island with so much potential end up restricted under US control? Strangely, keeping Puerto Rico in poverty hasn't exactly benefited everyday Americans either. Many US residents still live paycheck to paycheck, and with COVID-19 and rising inflation, building wealth has only become harder. In fact, Bank of America recently reported that nearly 34% of young Americans with significant assets doubt that traditional investments like stocks and bonds will deliver good returns. That's why many are now looking to alternative options like today's sponsor, Masterworks. Masterworks is a platform that opens the door for investors to buy shares in top-tier art without needing a fortune or specialized knowledge. They've paid over $60 million to investors from 23 successful sales of pieces by notable artists like Banksy, Basquiat, and Warhol, including a Basquiat sold for $8 million just last month. With Masterworks, investors can purchase shares in high-value art and potentially earn returns when these pieces sell again. Their platform is approaching $1 billion in total investments, and many shares sell out quickly. If you're interested, you can use the QR code on the screen or the link in the description for priority access. Just remember, though, that past performance doesn't guarantee future results, and all investments carry risk. Visit masterworks.io for full disclosures and regulations. But Puerto Rico's history of occupation didn't begin with the United States. For nearly 400 years, it was under Spanish rule, earning its name Rich Port for its strategic harbor in San Juan. Back then, the island's economy relied heavily on forced labor. Indigenous people and African slaves worked on sugar, tobacco, and coffee plantations that supplied Europe. That was until the late 1800s, when slavery was abolished, and the United States began showing interest in Puerto Rico. Its Caribbean location was perfect for securing trade routes and monitoring Cuba, making it valuable to the US. In a brief but intense conflict, the US defeated Spain and took control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. However, while the Philippines eventually gained independence, Puerto Rico remained a US territory, making it one of the world's oldest colonies. Under American rule, the US set up a government on the island, but enforced federal laws that severely limited Puerto Rico's autonomy. They also introduced trade and tax policies that prioritized US interests, often at Puerto Rico's expense. From the start, it was clear that the US planned to use Puerto Rico more for its own benefit than for the islands. They wanted to capitalize on what Puerto Rico had to offer, and one huge opportunity was in sugar production. The island's warm climate was perfect for growing sugar, which Puerto Ricans had already been cultivating for generations. For the US, it was cheaper to move their sugar production to Puerto Rico than to continue in places like Louisiana. American companies soon took control of the sugar industry, pushing out local farmers and making the island overly dependent on a single crop. Then came the Jones Act of 1917. It granted Puerto Ricans US citizenship and established a local legislature. But it also required that any goods moved between US ports be carried on American-owned ships with American crews. This made everything more expensive for Puerto Ricans, who were already earning very little. The focus on sugar continued through the Great Depression and World War II. Strategically, Puerto Rico's location was ideal for the US military to prevent German submarine threats. Thousands of Puerto Ricans even joined the US military to show their loyalty to the US, despite their limited rights. After the war, the US decided Puerto Rico's economy needed a shift. At that point, almost half of the island's jobs were in farming, but living standards were poor, even compared to the other Caribbean regions. In response, American officials launched Operation Bootstrap, a plan to industrialize Puerto Rico. While this seemed promising, it ended up benefiting wealthy US business owners far more than locals. US companies received tax breaks and subsidies to move operations to Puerto Rico, and since wages on the island were lower than on the mainland, many companies took advantage. For a few decades, Puerto Rico's economy did grow, with per capita income increasing and educational levels rising. This allowed the US to showcase Puerto Rico as a capitalist success, in contrast to communist Cuba, though most of the benefits went to the companies rather than the people of Puerto Rico. The US kept Puerto Rico shielded from global competition, which helped sustain this economic growth, but in the late 1970s, that protection started to fade, weakening the island's competitive edge. To counteract this, the US introduced Section 936, a tax break allowing American companies to operate in Puerto Rico without paying federal taxes as long as profits were returned to the mainland. Industries like pharmaceuticals saw a huge opportunity. For instance, a company like Johnson & Johnson could transfer patents for their drugs to Puerto Rico, produce them at lower costs, sell them at high prices in the US, and bring the profits back tax-free. By 1987, pharmaceutical companies were saving about $1.3 billion annually, a large share of Puerto Rico's economy at the time. While this tax policy created jobs and drew investments to the island, much of the profits still went back to the mainland companies, leaving Puerto Ricans with limited benefits. This setup made Puerto Rico's economy overly dependent on US laws, which made it vulnerable to any policy changes. And those changes came. In 1996, the Clinton administration began phasing out Section 936, compelling the repeal by 2006. With these incentives gone, businesses pulled out, sparking a severe economic downturn. Then in 2008, the real estate crash hit, sending Puerto Rico in a downward spiral. Because Puerto Rico is a US territory, not a state, it couldn't file for bankruptcy, and since it's not an independent country, it also couldn't seek help from international lenders. This left the island to manage the crisis on its own, leading to deep spending cuts, job losses, and declining public services. Unlike US states, Puerto Rico never built a strong, self-sufficient economy. So when it lost its competitive edge, it fell into a serious crisis. This led to three main problems: mass job losses, a brain drain as skilled workers left the island, and a spike in public debt. With companies leaving, jobs, especially in the manufacturing sector, disappeared, and unemployment kept rising, even as the mainland US economy started recovering from the 2008 crisis. Because Puerto Rico isn't a state, its residents don't qualify for the same federal support programs, leaving many of them more vulnerable to poverty. For example, a family on the island making the median income of $20,000 could receive around $5,500 in tax credits if they lived on the mainland, an amount that would greatly help struggling families in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico does participate in some federal assistance programs, like Medicaid and Medicare, but it receives between $1.7 billion and $5.4 billion less in annual benefits than if it were a state. This exclusion severely affects living standards on the island, with almost half of Puerto Rico's population now living below the poverty line. Limited public services like transportation and electricity are adding to a big problem in Puerto Rico. Skilled young workers are leaving for better lives in the mainland USA. This brain drain is happening at an unprecedented rate, with more educated, ambitious people, the lifeblood of the workforce, choosing to move. Since hitting its population peak in 2005, Puerto Rico's numbers have steadily dropped. The issue has two sides. Young people are moving away, and those who stay are aging. An older population brings challenges. Less tax revenue, but more spending on programs like healthcare. A need that's even greater here given Puerto Rico's high poverty rates. After the financial crash, Puerto Rico turned to borrowing to keep the island running, resulting in a debt load 4 times higher than typical U.S. states. While mismanagement is part of the issue, Washington's lack of support has been a major factor. Over half of Puerto Ricans rely on Medicare, or CHIP, but receive far less funding than similar U.S. states. This has forced the government to divert funds from other vital sectors. Puerto Rico's crumbling power grid, weighed down by $8 billion in debt, which shows the crisis, and despite the island's struggles, the U.S. government has failed to provide lasting solutions. Unfortunately, it seems this pattern will persist for a long time, with Puerto Rico left struggling to stay afloat. What do you think about the situation in Puerto Rico? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe for more content like this.